Warm welcome to this lecture series on organizational behavior. We are in the chapter on organizational culture. So this is going to be the outline of the chapter. We'll start with the definition of culture, and we also understand the impact of culture on individuals. We'll look at different levels of culture, and we'll talk about organizational culture in a specific sense, and also what are the dimensions of organizational culture. We will also talk about different aspects of culture like strong culture, weak culture, dominant culture, subculture, and concepts like this. We will also talk about how to create or how culture is created within an organization and how it is transmitted within an organization, and how organizational culture is expressed in organization. And also finally we'll talk about if you need to change organizational culture, what has to be done. Okay. So culture is a very broad term. In fact, many other disciplines also talk about culture as an idea. For example, sociology, anthropology, cultural studies. So this term of culture has been used in many other disciplines, and the definitions of it vary from discipline to discipline, because when other disciplines talk about culture, they talk about national level culture or cultural elements of a particular group. So it depends on the context in which they define this idea of culture. But in this particular chapter, we can define culture, or we can understand culture as the ways of thinking, behaving and believing that members of a social unit have in common. So let's say there is a social unit. It can be a region, it can be a state, or it can be a country, it can be a continent. So it depends on which unit we are considering. So let's say we take the unit of Asians. Even though Asians, there are multiple groups within this boundaries of Asia, we all are called as Asians. Even though there are differences between Asian countries, there are some elements which are common among Asians compared to other groups from other continents. For example, if you compare Europeans and Asians, we assume that Europeans are different from Asians, which means Asians as a unit have some common element within them. Not necessarily the genetical makeup, but also the way they behave, the way they understand the world, or the outlook they have towards things, the way they approach problems, things like that. For example, Asians are generally considered to be more collectivistic, which means when they make decisions, they consult with elders, or they will think about what others will think about them and all those things. But Europeans, they are considered to be more individualistic, or Westerners are considered to be more individualistic, which means they give more importance to individual rights and individuals' freedom or choice to make decisions. Again, these can be stereotypical ideas also, but at the same time there are some elements which are true also. Okay, so let's say if you take a smaller unit of India, so Indians, we assume that they have some common characteristics, some common belief systems, some common way of thinking compared to people of other country in Asia, maybe Chinese, or people like Sri Lankans or Japanese. For example, if you take Japanese are considered to be very punctual, hardworking, very sincere in whatever task they do. Indians, on the other hand, are considered to be more quick fix oriented, Indian jugaad we call it. So they are very good in finding out solutions which are workable. So these are some of the assumptions we make. Sometimes they are true also. So what I'm trying to say is, each of these social groups have some things which are common among them. So those elements can be called as culture. I'm putting it in very simple words. Things are not as simple as I explain. It can be more complicated. Okay, but to make you understand the common element, the idea of common element, I'm giving those examples. So So another definition says culture as the inherited ideas, beliefs and values and knowledge which constitute the shared basis of social action, which means a social group, how it will behave to a certain situation is determined by the kind of ideas, beliefs and values and knowledge which it has inherited over a period of time, which means historically the experiences the social group has underwent, that becomes the cultural values of that particular social group, and that decides how that social group will behave in a particular situation. Okay, for example, let's say there is a conflict situation. How will this social group behave depends on its history over a period of time and its interaction with other social groups, and also what it believes to be its core values, the social group's core values. Okay, so some social groups are very cooperative, some groups are very aggressive, some groups are very collaborative and cooperative. So these are some of the ways in which culture exhibits. And also culture, it's a very broad term, culture, because it includes a total range of activities and ideas of a group which is shared among people, and it is transmitted and reinforced by members of the group. So how is culture transmitted? Through reinforcement by other members. For example, if the larger social group believes in certain values, if one member doesn't agree to it or one member deviates from that idea, it is reinforced, or it is the person is made to follow those values by other members of the group. In other words, cultural values are reflected as social norms also. Norms means unwritten rules. Okay. So how does culture impact individual? So culture is like the kind of the core of any social group. It is the characteristics of a social group, and any social group consists of individual members. Sometimes there can be conflict between the individual members' value system and the larger group's value system. So that is where the friction between the individual and the larger group happens. So many times the larger social group tries to influence or change the individual, may not necessarily in a very direct way. That individual himself or herself may feel pressure within. This is like, if you remember the personality chapter, the super ego is nothing but the representation of the larger society. So in a way, the super ego disciplines or tries to reinforce the larger social values when the individual deviates from those norms. So we can also relate this with cognitive dissonance idea. If you remember, we studied cognitive dissonance in attitude chapter, where two conflicting ideas existing at the same time. Sometimes when your value system and the larger social group's value system conflict, it is a sort of conflict between you and you which believes in your rights and the you which believes in the larger social group's value system and its importance. So it becomes a sort of divided personality. I mean, I'm just using a very common language. So it becomes a kind of a conflict for the individual. Okay, culture is a very powerful mechanism which influences both conscious and unconscious level of the mind. So in a way, most of our behavior, the influence comes through these cultural norms, and it becomes very difficult for us to unlearn these cultural norms, especially when you have lived in a country or in a culture for a very long periods of time. Unless until we expose ourselves to newer situations, newer cultures, we become very fundamental in nature. So that's the danger of being part of a very strong culture or a very closed culture. Okay, so how does culture affects us consciously and unconsciously? I'll give a very simple example. So let's say you are meeting someone for the first time. Okay, in what ways do you have to greet this person, which is a very conscious behavior. So you will think about how to greet this person. Should I say hello, or should I say namaste, or should I say something else. So we use the greeting in a conscious way. Unconsciously, how does culture affect this behavior? So when you meet someone for the first time, how close you stand to this person. Okay, some cultures it is okay to stand very close to a person even if you meet them for the first time. Even between strangers, conversations happen. When conversations happen, people stand very close to each other in some cultures. Some cultures, people maintain a certain distance. Okay, so you never consciously think about where should I stand when I greet this person. So it happens at a very unconscious level. So a simple thing like greeting someone, both conscious level and unconscious level, culture impacts our behavior. Okay, so that is where culture is a very powerful mechanism which influences our behavior, not just simple behavioral elements, but also the way we think, the way we understand the world, in terms of our attitudes, how we perceive things. All these elements are strongly influenced by the larger social norm, which is the representation of the culture. Okay, like I said, culture influences our value system. What we think or what we consider as importance in our life is decided by the larger cultural values, because many of these values which we imbibe, which we get in our life, are through socialization. When we interact with others in the society, we understand what is important for us in our life. So our value system, our perception, our attitudes, everything is like influenced by culture. And culture is learned. So the society, who creates this culture, or how this culture is sustained? In fact, it's a very interesting question. It's not like culture stays there forever. Sometimes cultures change also within a social group. And also people learn culture through reinforcement from others in the group. So unless and until the social group believes these values are important for our existence, they will sustain that culture. They will try to reinforce it on other members. At some point, when members feel these values are not suiting us for the social group, or these values are not helping us for in the survival of the larger social group, those values might lose their importance. So that is where culture may change. But most of the times, this change happens after a lot of pressure, either from inside or from outside. Otherwise, culture is believed to be true. On a normal day, people will never question these cultural values. So that is how culture is learnt and reinforced. Okay. When we say culture, culture can be of different levels. Like I said, social groups can be of different sizes, different levels. Like I said, it can be a region, maybe a state, or it can be a district, or it can be a particular place, a city or a town. It can be a country, it can be a continent. So culture can be of different levels. Culture can exist at organizational levels also. So this is where we are moving towards understanding what is organizational culture. Organizational culture means every organization is a social unit. Every organization is a social entity. So every organization has a history, and also the kind of experiences that the organization has underwent changes from one organization to another. In other words, every organization's culture and experiences, history are unique compared to other organizations. So every organization has a unique history and culture. So that leads to culture at organizational level. So what is organizational culture? Organizational culture is the collective programming of the mind which distinguishes the members of one organization from the other. For example, you are working in a company like Tata. You belong to Tata Group. Vis-a-vis, another employee belongs to Infosys. So TCS employees and Infosys employees, obviously there will be differences in the way they approach work-related problems. Okay. I mean, specifically if they have worked there for long years in that particular organization. So the way things are managed in a company like TCS, organization is like TCS, will be very different from the way things are managed in an organization like Infosys. And also the value systems also differ. Okay, so organizational culture is cultural differences are exhibited in terms of cultural differences across organizations. Professionalization means every job or every profession, there might be certain core values. For example, if you are a doctor, if you are a physician, there are certain core values which are common among all the doctors throughout the world. Similarly, if you are a researcher, academic researcher, the set of experiences you undergo are more or less similar for academic researchers throughout the world. So the profession of academics has a certain core values which are common among people irrespective of the nationality they belong to, or irrespective of the organization they belong to. So sometimes there can be overlapping or conflicting cultures in terms of national culture, regional culture, organizational culture and professionalization. For example, as a person, I might belong to a particular continent and also a particular country where there are common elements between my country and the continent, but there are also some differences. Similarly, I work in a certain organization which has a certain kind of a culture, and also my profession also insists on certain value system. So all these things creates a kind of a dynamic situation where the individuals has to balance out the demands from each of those culture. So the point of insisting on this idea is it's not as simple as we think. Okay, there are multiple layers of culture, multiple levels of culture, multiple ways of approaching culture. Okay, so now we are moving towards organizational culture. Organizational culture, to explain it in simple words, it is like a personality of an organization. So personality for a person is personality. If you remember the concepts we learned in personality are the core characteristics of an individual, which reflects in his or her behavior, attitude, perception, things like that. Similarly, for an organization, if you take an organization as an entity, the organizational culture is like the personality of the organization. So the organizational culture of the organization decides how that particular organization will behave in a certain situation. It can be a market challenge, it can be a crisis situation, it can be, in situations where they make profit or a change initiative. So the culture of the organization influences how an organization reacts to these kind of different situations. So it is the shared meaning and beliefs within an organization that determines the larger degree how employees act. So like we saw earlier, the organizational culture influences the employee's behavior, and that determines how employee will act or behave in a situation within the organization. And like national culture, organizational culture is perceived and shared by employees. So many times organizational culture is imbibed, culture is imbibed within the individuals, and also it is shared among employees. Okay, so if you ask someone what is the your organizational culture, they may not be able to say what it actually means for them. But when you look at their behavior, you will understand how their organizational culture manifests itself in individual employees' behavior. Okay. So organizational culture also varies across industrial sectors. What I mean to say is, education institutions, there might be certain kind of all the education institutions, they might have similar culture. IT industries, they might have similar culture. Medical institutions, they may have similar culture. So there can be similarity in terms of sector also. That is because those sectors are driven by certain kind of motives. So what drives the sector can also influence the organizational culture of the organizations which are part of the sector. For example, let's say telecom sector. Right now in India, telecom sector is highly competitive. So that gives a sense of competition or a sense of motive to individual organizations in that particular sector also. So every organization in that sector, telecom sector, they have to be competitive. That becomes the DNA of the organization, and that influences the individual members or the employees' behavior also. For example, teaching profession, teaching sector, academic sector is considered to be, relatively a very calm and, very easygoing kind of a sector, not very competitive. I mean, it changes in some cases also. So education institutions, the goal is long term, to be an expert power, to influence others. But industrial organizations, the goal is to achieve, to be very competitive. Bureaucracy, like government sector, the motive is control, to try to create order. So all the organizations in this sector, government sector, they tend to have a similar kind of culture. One-man organizations, organizations owned by families or business, owned by families or few people, they tend to be very dependency oriented. They try to create dependency among its employees. NGOs or community service organizations, they tend to be more, they tend to be, they reach out to people. For example, an organization like, a religious institution, a church or a mutt, their focus is not to be very competitive. Their focus is to help. At least in their philosophy, it is to help others. So that the motive will be extension. Okay. So this particular slide talks about how industry-wise also there might be similarities across sectors and also organizations. Okay. So I'll stop here. In the next section, we'll talk about the dimensions of organizational culture or culture. In fact, this is a very popular model. It talks about 5 different elements of culture. Okay. This model is proposed by someone called Hofstede. He's, this is a relatively old model, around 1980s to 1990s it was proposed. But even now, this model is used to understand organizational culture and also national level culture. So I'll stop here. In the next section, we'll talk more elaborately about this particular model. Till then, take care.